2,000 years ago, there was a powerful empire famous not only for the wonderful things it created, but also for some of the terrible things it did. It was called the Roman Empire because its 60 million people were ruled by an emperor who lived in the Italian city of Rome. The emperor ruled over many different types of people because the empire was so big it stretched across 3 different continents. In Africa, it reached as far to the south as Egypt. In Europe, as far to the west as Spain. In Asia, as far to the east as Turkey. And in the British Isles, as far to the north as the border of Scotland, where the Emperor Hadrian built the Great Wall seen here. The Roman Empire was really just one big country, made up of many separate states they called provinces, that had been captured by the great army of Rome. And everyone who lived in the empire paid Roman taxes, obeyed Roman laws, and spoke the Roman language called Latin. According to legend, Rome was founded in 753 B.C. by Romulus, who, along with his twin brother, Remus, were said to have been nursed by a wolf when they were babies. Romulus killed his brother and became the first king of Rome, and he founded his city on this hill, near the banks of the beautiful Tiber River seen here. Over the centuries, Rome got bigger and bigger, and so did the empire, because Roman soldiers kept conquering one country after another, always bringing their way of life to the people they conquered. And it wasn't long before the empire got so huge it was not easy to rule. But the Romans were very skilled in most things they did, and they were very well organized, and this helped them succeed where others failed. For example, they built hundreds of excellent stone-paved roads like this one that linked the distant parts of their empire to the capital city. And when they came to a river, they always built a fine stone bridge to cross it. And we are really lucky they built things so well, because we can learn a lot about how the Romans lived thousands of years ago, just by visiting a few of the many Roman buildings that are still standing today. If we visited the ruins of Roman cities that were located in different parts of the empire, cities that were built very far from one another, we would always find the same kinds of buildings. For example, nearly all Roman cities had theaters that looked a lot like this one, which is in Spain. In these theaters, people sat on stone seats, while on the stage below, actors performed plays with their faces hidden behind masks. The actors wore masks because masks made it easier for the audience to understand what the play was all about. Another type of building found in most Roman cities were the Colosseums. Here we see the Colosseum in Rome. It was a huge building that could hold about 70,000 people. These people were ordinary citizens who came to watch men called gladiators fight other men and animals to the death. In fact, wild animals such as rhinoceroses and even giraffes were captured in Africa just so they could fight against the gladiators in the Colosseums. And because for a long time Christianity was illegal in the Roman Empire, Christians were sometimes fed to the lions just to please the crowd. Besides Colosseums and theaters, most Roman cities also had places called circuses. The circus in Rome was a huge racetrack where as many as 200,000 people came to watch the chariot races. Chariots were wheeled carriages that were pulled around the track by powerful teams of horses. The Romans also loved being clean, and just about every town in the Roman Empire had public bathhouses like the one seen here. They were places where people could take hot or cold baths and also get exercise. The Romans were able to have bathhouses because every town had an excellent system for supplying running water, not only for bathing, but for drinking and for sanitation as well. That was why, on the outskirts of many Roman towns, you would see structures that looked like bridges, but were really things called aqueducts, through which fresh water was carried to the cities from streams in the nearby hills. In Roman cities, most ordinary people lived in apartments that were in buildings like these. But the richer people and their slaves lived in private houses called villas. In these villas, it was very common to find floors which were made from mosaic tiles, thousands of tiny pieces of colored glass, stone, or pottery, which were cemented together to make beautiful designs. And oftentimes, hidden under these floors were passages through which hot air flowed to keep the houses warm in winter. The Romans loved decoration, and they usually painted the walls of their houses with all kinds of colorful designs, such as those seen here. And that was why Roman sculptors carved beautiful statues and monuments out of stone, which stood in every public square. Some, like the Emperor Trajan's column seen here, had very complicated carvings. Many of the carvings showed Romans fighting their enemies. And it was so the citizens would always be reminded of Rome's important military victories that special monuments called triumphal arches were built. These enormous carved structures also helped make the Romans feel proud of the greatness of their empire. Roman cities also had special places where you could go shopping. Here we see Trajan's market in Rome, where a long time ago you would have found people selling and buying all kinds of things. Besides all the different sorts of buildings we have just seen, Roman cities also had large public squares called forums, where people gathered, where government buildings were located, and where speeches were made. But usually, of all the buildings in their fine cities, the most beautiful ones were the temples they built for their many gods and goddesses. The Roman religion wasn't based on a book of teachings, such as the Bible or the Koran. Instead, it was a religion that developed over many centuries as the Romans took over parts of other, older religions. And ordinary Romans learned about the powers of their gods through stories called myths that had been told and retold for as long as anyone could remember. The Romans worshipped hundreds of different gods and goddesses whose myths came from several different lands. Some, like the myths of the god of the Nile, came from Egypt, while other myths, like those of Mithras, the warrior god of light, came from Persia and were the favorites among the slaves and soldiers. But nearly all of the most important Roman myths originally came from ancient Greece. After the Romans conquered Greece around 140 BC, they gave the Greek gods and goddesses new names and worshipped them as their own. For example, the god Neptune seen here was believed to rule the sea and all the creatures that lived in it. And because the Romans depended on the sea not just for food, but for transportation as well, sailors always prayed to Neptune that they would have a safe voyage. The goddess Minerva seen here was also very important to the Romans. At first, she was only worshipped by people who wanted to improve their skill at weaving and spinning. But later on, She was the goddess people worshipped if they wanted to be able to think better and be smarter. The god seen here is Mercury. He was the messenger of the gods, and the god of business and money. So if you wanted your business to make more money, you worshipped Mercury. And this great god is Jupiter, the king of all the gods, and the ruler of the universe. Jupiter was the son of Saturn, and was the father of some of Rome's most important gods and goddesses. That is why he is pictured here holding his daughter, the goddess Minerva, because Roman myths told of how she had been born from Jupiter's forehead fully grown. Another unusual thing about the Roman religion, which happened because people created myths about their emperors, was that the citizens worshipped some emperors as gods and built temples in their honor. Roman temples weren't like churches, synagogues, or mosques, because they weren't places that ordinary people could ever enter, since the Romans believed that the temples were the actual houses of the gods. And that was why only specially trained priests and priestesses were allowed inside. The main way that the Romans worshipped was by sacrificing a valuable animal, such as a goat, a sheep, or a cow, and then, to please the gods even more, burning the animal's flesh on altars like these that stood outside the temples. It is interesting to think that Christianity began in a Roman province called Judea at a time when animal sacrifices were still very commonplace, and that Romans put Jesus Christ to death by crucifixion because they thought he was causing political and religious trouble in the province. The Romans used harsh punishments like crucifixion to keep order in their empire. And for a long time it seemed to work, because after the death of Christ, they had 200 years of peace and prosperity. But after that, the empire began to fall apart. First, because it was being attacked more and more often by tribes from the north called barbarians. And second, because many of the emperors were so busy seeking pleasure that they had little time to rule. By the year 395 A.D., the Romans had decided to divide the empire in two, so everything would be easier to control. The western half of the empire was ruled by an emperor from the city of Rome, and the eastern half was ruled by another emperor who lived in the city of Constantinople, which is today's city of Istanbul, Turkey. And by that time, the Romans had begun to follow the Christian faith. But even having two capital cities couldn't save the empire from falling apart, because in 476 A.D., the western half was captured by the barbarians. And after that, its lands were split up into many separate kingdoms with many different rulers. But in the Eastern Empire, Roman emperors continued to rule, and many of the customs and laws of ancient Rome were kept alive, until finally, in the year 1453, the last tiny bit of Rome's once great empire was destroyed. But it is amazing to think that by then over 2,000 years had gone by since the founding of Rome, and that during this time, lots of very big changes had taken place in the world. In fact, by the time the Eastern Roman Empire finally fell to the Turks, European explorers and new types of sailing ships had already entered a new era, now called the Great Age of Exploration. And they were well on their way to finding continents and races of people the Romans had never even dreamed of. True or false? The ancient Romans sometimes worshipped their dead emperors as gods. True or false? The ancient Romans were not very good at building things. True or false? The Roman Empire was on 3 different continents. True or false? The Roman god of the sea was named Neptune. True or false? You would expect to see acrobats and clowns at a Roman circus. True or false? The Romans built triumphal arches to remind them of their great military victories. True or false? Gladiators ruled the Roman Empire for many centuries. True or false? Roman roads were called aqueducts. True or false? The Roman Empire never went further north than France. True or false? Jesus Christ was born in the Roman Empire.